Okay, so thanks everyone. Welcome to the session on creative intervention. So my name's Glen Tarman. I was one of the founders of Liberate Tate, and I'm going to present something around our exploration of creative intervention. So just a little bit about me. So I've just done 3 years as the advocacy director of the humanitarian NGO Action Against Hunger. Before that, I was the advocacy director at Bond, the development NGO platform in the UK. Previously, in the late 90s, I was part of putting NGOs online at a place called One World, which was one of the earlier pioneer organizations exhorting charities to consider that the internet might be an important thing for their operations. And we had some good years there of taking charities online and beginning the early parts of charity campaigning using the web. In 2005, I was part of the group that co-founded a campaign called Make Poverty History, and I led on digital for Make Poverty History. So if you got an email from that time, pre-social media, that was because of the work that myself and others did. So I'm going to take you through, if I can get the clicker to work. I'm going to introduce the session in a moment, but I just wanted to start off by saying something relatively straightforward, that in many aspects, creativity is the fuel of effective digital and campaigning. Creativity has come up so much in our discussions here at the eCampaigning Forum, but it's not something that's front and center of how we think about things. In the professional organizations we work in, there is often the creative, there's the creative output. A lot of our discussions about successful campaigning have spoken about, sometimes explicitly, that it was the creative part of it that made it, not just in terms of the creatives, but the approach to the campaigning that made it successful. And yet, our discussions don't extend to the spaces where people are trained to be creative, are creative for in a different world, the art world. So I think we need a bigger conversation about the relationship to change in other places. And so what I want to take you through is my exploration of that with the group Liberate Tate. As I'm going through it, I'm going to try and speak to some of the issues that I think are potentially important around a conversation that we might have about the role of creative intervention, but also how the art world and our world intermingle, how broader social change making also encompasses artists, and what that might mean for us thinking about change. And I want to put that in the context of the introduction we had from David Bent from the Forum for the Future about the transformation that's needed to a sustainable future within limits at the same time as digital transformation. And I think this hopefully will speak to some of the importance of this. As somebody interested in both art and activism, in early 2010 there was a workshop at the Tate on art and activism. I thought, that's cool, I'll go along to that, learn about the interrelation of two different things. And the first Saturday was absolutely fantastic. We were in a room very much like this with about 50 folk looking at different examples of political art and also the relationship between different activist groups. Now, it was a 2-day workshop, one Saturday and then the next weekend. During the week of that, the facilitator was called into Tate with full security in that session and was told that Tate couldn't host any activism towards the institution itself or any of its sponsors. And so on the second Saturday, the facilitator, a guy called John Jordan, alerted us to that communication and that he'd been brought in to make sure that nothing happened. So our response, therefore, my response there was, we weren't planning to do an action against Tate or its sponsors, but this felt completely wrong that there was a curtailment of free expression. And who were these sponsors anyway? And why was it the case that the sponsorship of Tate was such a thing that they would make sure that any workshop that was about social change in any way would not result in any action? And so as a symbolic disobedience against that, we just did a very, very simple action, which this is the top of the Tate Modern, and we just put the words art not oil across the front, just as a kind of something's really wrong here. And then we started looking into a little bit more about the influence of oil companies in our art world and what we might do in response to that. So before I go into a little bit of that, there had been various organisations taken an interest in that. A group called Art Not Oil, which resulted from an activist group, Rising Tide, had spent a number of years from 2003, 2004, protesting outside of, for example, the National Portrait Gallery. BP sponsors the Portrait Awards there, and so they had protested the presence of the oil company as protesters outside in a traditional mode of protest with placards, perhaps a little bit of theatre, dressing up and so on. And also another fantastic group. Have any of you heard of Platform? So for those of you who haven't, do check them out. They work, they're an NGO, but they also work in the creative space, and they take a particular interest around environmental issues and particularly oil companies. And they produce something called the Carbon Web. And you might not be able to read this, but their analysis is really how do oil companies get to do what they're doing, because what they're doing is destroying the planet. So what is the structure of relationships that they have beyond the oil company that allow that to happen? So they're in the different spheres of influence about government relations, or in finance, or wider industry, or the legal basis under which they extract fossil fuels. We might be very familiar with that. And then in the external affairs space, you've got their relationship with the media, with PR companies that they will use, the relationship with lobby groups, and indeed NGOs that are taking an interest in them, whether it's environmental groups, Platform or others, who they might co-opt or they might be opposed by. And they need to actively manage all those relationships. But one that Platform put in the mix was cultural institutions. They didn't see the relationship of cultural institutions with an oil company as one of philanthropic sponsorship, CSR, and so on. They elaborated or projected an idea which the oil companies had themselves of something called a social license to operate. So obviously the extractive industry is a pretty dirty business. You go to other foreign lands, you screw up their place by extracting the oil out of the land. That might create a war, it might create environmental damage. You manage that relationship one way or the other. And you also need to have elites on board in the different power centres. So in London, the sponsorship of the galleries is part of their way of capturing elite attention and putting forward them as an organisation that is doing social good, and it's part of their resistance to any kind of proper regulation of their activities. So you can learn a lot more about the social license to operate, which is an oil company concept from Platform, but that's the context. Now, BP has been a sponsor of Tate since 1990. So it's built up over time a huge corporate hijack of an institution. The most visible marks are, if you walk through the gallery, BP displays supported by BP. Actually, a couple of years ago, the major collection of British art is now branded the BP Walk Through British Art. So our national collection of British art is brought to you by an oil company. So there's lots to say about that, but certainly myself at the workshop we were in, and many others say this needs to change. So I just want to speak a little bit about the inspiration. We had a session on inspiration before, and a lot of artists have been involved more and more from the 60s in social movement one way or the other. And still to this day, artists are involved one way or the other. And what I want to speak to is really that difference between artists being, if you like, the prettifiers of the movement, the decorators. There's an amazing tradition of, say, banner artwork, and we're all involved one way or another in having that. But from the 60s onwards, and particularly with the rise of the internet as well, you've got a new class of artists really being involved in social action themselves as organisers and playing a far more fundamental role in social change. And I think it's one in the NGO world and the charity world that we don't acknowledge enough. Now, any of you know Guerrilla Girls, Joseph Beuys, ACT UP, or Hans Hacker? Any of those names familiar to you? Who have you heard of before?
Specifically Joseph Beuys.
Yeah. Anybody else beyond Joseph Beuys? So the Guerrilla Girls, great heroes of ours, and people we've been fortunate enough to work around. They made some interventions in the art world, and that was important for us to really acknowledge there, check them out. They were really initially about why is it that most public galleries, and indeed more important other cultural institutions, are just packed full of art by men? Where are women artists in their representation? And they wear gorilla suits and go have some fun. So do check them out, they're great heroes of ours. Joseph Beuys was an artist who said everybody can be an artist. So he didn't give a special privilege to artists in particular. He was also one of the founders of the Green Party in Germany. And here he's creating a work called 7,000 Oaks. It's an artwork with planting of 7,000 oak trees at one of the big art festivals. Another group that I think is worth pointing to are ACT UP. They had, if you like, an art and cultural wing called Grand Fury, and they were one of the groups around the movement to put people living with HIV and AIDS at the forefront of the movement, but they also recognised fairly on that art would be part of making their power. And so this is a Keith Haring work a couple of years later. But they're part of the heritage, we feel, of what we do, and we think that there's a huge and broader movement that people should try and check out a lot more. Hans Hacker is a really interesting guy because he's a German artist but lives in New York. This is a work from many, many years back. He put a poll in a museum which asked a question about the political basis under some of the folks that were on the governing body of the museum. And he comes from a tradition known as institutional critique. So the art world was very willing to take within its activity a movement that became known as institutional critique, which would critique the art world itself as part of the art system. So there's a lot of artists were the first wave and second wave of institutional critique that were calling out the wrong things with the art world, but they were part of the art world. And they lived with that contradiction, and that was very much a movement. And we as Liberate Tate were kind of happy to say, like, because we're working just around Tate, we are part of the third wave of institutional critique, but we operate slightly differently, and I want to point you to some ideas about what that might be about. Sorry, I'm taking this the wrong way here. One of the hallmarks of this group of artists, and I'm not going to do a survey of artists because I'm going to use Liberate Tate to make some other points, is that they're moving beyond representation. So politics has been represented by artists, and politics is represented by NGOs and charities all the time. That's what we do. But the difference here is that the movements reject representation of politics to make creative interventions which are themselves political interventions. And so you're not actually representing. I'm not going to go into that concept too much, but if you can just kind of take that top line around it. And one particular group that I thought would be useful to bring into this space, has anybody heard of the Critical Art Ensemble? So these guys are kind of lost in space. They wrote some fundamental texts that a lot of us who were around at the time really took an interest about how will civil disobedience work in the digital age. And these books happened in the 90s. They were a beginning of putting forward concepts about how the media was used in social change and something called tactical media. So in the early days of the internet and other different tools and how they would combine in social action, the artists were at the forefront. These were the guys that, with others, were involved in the first denial service attacks, but they were both practitioners and theorists and artists. Very, very cool bunch of folks. And when the first e-campaigning forum started 2002. Those of us who kind of rocked up to that, a lot of us had been influenced by these people, so it's part of the waves of influence. You know, e-campaigning didn't begin with the Obama campaign. E-campaigning didn't begin with the political electioneering, you know, in the mid-2000s. So I think another appeal from me is to really look back at our heritage and take some hints as to what was really underlying some of the principles about what we might apply now. So as Tate, as Liberate Tate, we wanted to explore creative intervention, and we wanted to take the fact that Tate had been hijacked by BP as our subject matter. And unlike a lot of artists, we said we want BP out of Tate. We will make site-specific work in Tate, but we had a cause, we had an aim. A lot of artists will not speak about a particular aim. They'll speak about a lot of issues, but they are fearful of their art being seen in that, what they might see as a reductive way. We wanted to say, we're going to make great art, but we've got a cause. We are artists with a cause, and we'll be explicit about that. So we'd done a modest action of the Art Not Oil at the top. A few months later, there was a Tate Modern's 10th anniversary. We went into Tate. The Gulf of Mexico oil spill had begun. We went into Tate Modern. We released huge, big black helium balloons, which went up to the roof of Tate Modern. And we also strung to those balloons dead fish and seabirds. The dead fish were actually dead fish. The seabirds we made with other materials. And so that was kind of our arrival. So Tate had to go in with air rifles to shoot down those balloons. And then somebody sent us a ticket to an event. The Gulf of Mexico spill is happening, and what does Tate do? It sends out a party to invite to the great and the good. Come to Tate Britain summer party, celebrating 20 years of BP support for Tate. So what the hell is going on at this institution that they believe it's appropriate to do that at a time of environmental destruction by their partner? And we wanted to therefore make quite a splash, and so we rolled up with drums of what was molasses, an oil-like substance of which we became experts at. And on the outside, along the entrance, we just covered the entrance with an oil spill and called it License to Spill, mirroring that social license to operate that we were speaking about before. Inside, Tony and Bobby went inside with lovely floral dresses for the party, underneath which they had plastic sacks, and at an appropriate moment in the party, they had a little spill. And you can see that it's going on the floor, and they took off their shoes and tried to clear it up. And they said to everybody, they were very apologetic, it's just tiny spill. And that kind of echoed the words of the BP CEO at the time that, you know, it's a big ocean and it's just a little spill. I'll go the right way eventually. What we were not fearful around as well is to use modes of art, forms of art, but also activist language as well. But we were trying to work across those different balances. And in this period, we moved more and more into recognizing that the more we were definitely artists creating art, the more difficult it would be for Tate to deal with us. They would have a decision dilemma, that classic thing that you want to create from a campaigning point of view. This was a work called Human Cost. It was on the anniversary of the Gulf of Mexico spill. We went into a broader exhibition that you can't see there called Single Form, which was sculptures of the human body in Tate Britain. One of the members of the group lay on the floor, we poured oil over them, and then we left him there for 87 minutes, a minute for every day that oil had poured into the Gulf of Mexico. What we noticed was whenever we did these performances, Tate would start putting around this kind of safety call to not let people around. And we kind of thought that was really cool. It was kind of like making it an exhibit in itself. So we really liked that one. Do, by the way, interrupt me if you want to know anything more about what we're doing. Look,
Very quickly.
Yeah, please.
Did the press team at Tate deal with the oil spillage in any way, or did they just ignore it completely?
Yeah, so Tate would have a very banal statement that they put out, which would be, you know, we welcome BP's support. BP is a long-term supporter of the arts. Da, da, da. You know, it was just a kind of banal text that they'd agreed with BP that they'd trot out. And, you know, obviously the license to spill got a huge amount of media coverage. When they spoke to the issue a little bit more, Nick Sirota would say to the media something like, you don't drop your friend just because there's been an accident. So what you saw was them going beyond to defend an oil company. So this wasn't just, which was just part of how they'd been hijacked to kind of say, look, it's not a problem what's going on here. They're great, these guys, they've just had an accident.
And they'll do similar in response to your work, presumably.
They were very careful, and we wanted to push them a lot, because if they were to shut us down fully or not allow us to do something, they were therefore censoring our art. And we knew that, and we wanted to push it a lot further. So we felt that when we were elevating what we were doing and speaking to the issues, that the more and more they were trotting out these banal reactives, they weren't dealing with the issues, and the press coverage began to deal with the framing of the issues as we were presenting it. So I think there's lessons for them there about, you know, you can't just trot out your reactives again and again. There's a point at which you will lose the debate, and something more serious is happening that you need to speak to. So what we're trying to do, and what we feel is really important, is to look at institutions. We really think that the public art institutions are really important. Obviously Tate Modern and less so Tate Britain are public institutions which millions of people go to every year. They are the pinnacle of any kind of public credit of different artists, if you're in that collection. And our view was simply, we need to think of these institutions as institutions that could be better, but also that we need to know how they work. A lot of artists would say, look, I'm not interested in the Tate, you know, it's the establishment, so what? Our view is, and we're looking at these issues more and more, is that institutions really count. They're our infrastructure, they provide us with support. It was really cool that Tate did a workshop on art and activism. But also they were keeping the payments from the oil company secret. So a few years ago, I put in a Freedom of Information request to say, how much are the oil company paying you for the services that you're providing to them? Sorry, we can't tell you. Commercial information. So Platform and a couple of other public interest law and FOI experts took the case on when I didn't have the time or this expertise to take it on further. And we took it to the Information Commissioner and then to the Information Tribunal. And this was just before the court case. And this is a work called Hidden Figures. Within the Tate at the same time, there was an exhibition of an artwork called Black Square. So we were echoing an artwork in there at the time. And we had this big cloth. We billowed it up, and then people walked underneath it, and it dropped back down on them. Hidden Figures. Maybe a little bit too literal, but there you are. Kids loved it. Kids went mad for it, and for 3 hours, children were playing. And that was what we hoped to do. We wanted to do a work that the Tate Education Department would be going, oh, I wish we'd done that. When the amount was revealed, they only revealed an amount to 2006. And that demonstrated that the payment was, on average, £224,000 a year to Tate. Now, just in marketing terms, that's just a joke. But we got the figure made public, working with Moncton's Chambers, Request Initiative, Platform, and myself and others. And so we did this piece, throwing some money we'd created into the lovely new rotunda at Tate Britain. Nick Sirota on one side, the director, and I didn't mention before, the chief exec of the board of Tate is John Brown, the ex-CEO of BP. This hijack is total. It's, the guy is, you know, an art lover. He's been, you know, a good chair in many ways, but they're in it. Everything we do is also pointing to the fact that he's responsible. Is he going to let BP out?
So just one amount, I'm shocked by how little they're actually paying them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me that it's purely nepotism rather than financial gain, right? I mean, because you could get much bigger sponsors that have just as high profile names that can do much more for the Tate,
Yeah.
but aren't as corrupt. So it's
Yeah.
it's quite shocking.
Also, a lot of people thought it was bigger, so that if it went, it would be a problem. Now, you know, £250,000 is still a, you know, relatively big chunk of change, but it's not in the overall budget of Tate. Tate would survive without BP.
Was it BP or Shell this morning when they announced that the chief executive was getting a ridiculous bonus despite these changes because he managed the company through such a turbulent time, so although the profits have dipped.
Yeah. And I want to mention that in a context later on. But you're absolutely right. Right now, today, the BP AGM is going to, some investors will try and make sure that that doesn't go through, but it will go through. The guy will get millions. It's part of what we're doing also has that hallmark of, if you do things in the art world, if you do things in a different tone and manner, you can end up on the front page of the Financial Times. So one of the people in the group went into their chief exec and the NGO they work from, a few of us in the Art Collective are from NGOs, and just said, front page of the Financial Times, £85. We'd spent 85 quid on some petrol canisters, sunflower oil and charcoal. And we'd got them into Tate through staff. So we were always working with different staff. And so they smuggled in the materials, put them in a place that we could collect them on the way in, so we could get from the door check. We've smuggled in, you know, the biggest object ever to go into an art gallery with the gift, and become quite expert. If we wanted to do an art heist and actually steal stuff, we'd be really good, but we do it the other way around. So the debate started getting through into the television programs. And again, we started to do works on a sort of different mode, and we're still kind of doing things that, speaking truth to power, you know, things that you would associate with social movements, NGOs, and bold and courageous charities. This was a work we did called Parts Per Million, when the British collection of art was rebranded. The very week that that collection was rebranded, the parts per million in the atmosphere went over 400. So 350 parts per million being the level that we need to get back to for a safe, livable planet. But the very week they rebranded, it tipped 400. And it was revealed that BP is the third most responsible company in the world for the emissions in the atmosphere. So, you know, 2.5% of the emissions out there of carbon in our atmosphere are from BP. Parts Per Million was a work where we went into a particular gallery in the era where the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere was the result of human activity. So up to the Industrial Revolution, and what we did was walk through Tate, through galleries in which the human impact in the atmosphere was negligible. when that art was being made. The art in this gallery was made at a time when the human activity was changing the atmosphere. So you've got in there beautiful landscapes and so on, and all kinds of different pieces of work. So this is where we began parts per million. And we called out the number of parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere when the art was created, and began in this gallery. So we'd move up to say this is 1960, and we were reading from these books and counting up from the beginning of the art in that gallery, which is in chronological order, to the latest art in that gallery. What was the parts per million? It's probably worth me speaking about the veils. So we were developing a language. Obviously in the beginning it was quite important for us to somehow, it shouldn't be about us as individuals. You know, we wanted a collective approach, but equally some of us were artists in our own right. From my point of view, you know, I was going into lobby meetings the next day with secretaries of state and things like that. It was quite useful maybe to be wearing a veil. And we kept with it. And when you're doing these works and people aren't looking at you as you're experiencing something quite extraordinary. And we paid a lot of attention to that experience. And here there's actually people's mums were involved. You know, they're wearing the veils, kind of like, could I do one of those? Yeah, come on, we're doing it. So they as well kind of would have the courage to come and do something like this that they would never do without the veils. And it became part of our kind of sort of mournful visual language around these activities. So there we are with The Gift. We showed you the film earlier, the clip, The Gift, the documentary's online, along with the performance clip that we put around. What we were also doing, if you didn't pick it up from the film earlier, was gifting this to the nation. So under the 1992 Museums and Galleries Act, if you're, say, privileged folk and you find a nice painting in your attic, you can go to any public institution and say, I actually want to give this to the nation. And the board of that public institution must decide whether they'll take it into the national collection. And so we used that piece of legislation to do that, which meant that it had to go to the board. So whether the board were told about this or not, the board had to make a decision as to whether this was going to be in the Britain's National Collection of Art. And who's the chair of the board? Who was going to decide that? The ex-CEO of BP. This is Timepiece, which was, sorry. Yeah, so they took it away and put it in their art store in Enfield. And we waited for this decision, and then they actually emailed one of our supporters to say there'd been a decision and they weren't going to take it into the national collection. But they were willing to take the photographs that we'd provided with them and put them in the archive of Tate. So you can go to the Tate archives and request the photographs that we've put in there and see that. At Tate Britain, yeah.
And that's something Tate can decide, despite the fact that
Yeah, so Tate Archive is an extraordinary place full of artworks and documentation and things around artists, like their diaries or sketchbooks and things like that. So it's something that people don't know so much about, and if you look at kind of socially engaged artists and so on, you can find a lot of their work there. And a lot of things from the archive end up in being exhibited, or things that they feel uncomfortable about will be put into the archive. So it's like a convenient tool. But that's our archive. That's a public archive. It's something we can go into Tate and unask for. With all the work we do a label about a piece of our art and make it available for people to see. And this was Timepiece, the work we did last year. So last year we knew that we needed to begin to raise the ante, because this year was the year in which they'd decide whether to take on another 5-year contract with BP. So we performed a piece called Timepiece, and I've just got a few more works to show you, then I'd like to open it up for whatever you might be interested in discussing. We wanted to raise the stakes, and we felt that that meant extending our occupation of Tate. After all, they'd let in an oil company. And we were going to occupy Tate Modern. But rather than being confrontational, we wanted to do a sort of more quieter piece, and we called it Timepiece. And this is the label. The presentation will go around, and you can see this online. But the performance took place from high tide on the 13th of June 2015, and it ended at high tide the next day. And it was an exploration of time and tides and different forms of time, but also the time that BP needs to go. It was a work where we brought in texts and books and willow charcoal, and people would wear the veils, take a book of their choice, and write any text that they wanted to from that book onto the floor of the turbine hall. And bit by bit, the words moved up.
10 minutes.
Thanks. So here's some of that text. There's a bibliography online. I'm just going to speak a little bit about some of the books that might be worth you looking at. So these were just, we spoke about inspirations in the other section, so these were a selection of texts about climate change, about art, about politics, novels, non-fiction, academic books. We were still employing activist techniques, so this is a moment before the gallery closes. We're mirroring an earlier work we did called Sunflower, where we squeezed BP art tubes full of black paint into the same space. But this is about, are they going to eject us? We've got all our kit here. We are going to control this space. And we've also got a compost toilet. They so thought we were not going to go away. We were just going to go away. And then we assembled the compost toilet. And I think they realized we're not going anywhere. They called the police, but they kept in there. So remember I spoke to you about the experience. Imagine being in the Tate all night and what it feels like and how magical it is. You're not on one of those kids' sleepovers. We've taken over the Tate and we're making art in there. It's the joy that we're trying to bring to ourselves is we don't deny, you know. We want to have those moments, and we want to involve anybody who wants to be involved in those moments. So running through quickly in the interest of time, right from the beginning we wanted to inspire others. The Natural History Museum is an amazing organisation that acknowledges us as their inspiration to be. And they're based in New York. This is their touring truck. And this is an exhibit they've got at the American Museums Association's exhibition. They have become a museum registered in America as an actual museum. And here it is. Will the story of the sixth mass extinction ever include the role of its sponsor, which is David Koch, which is a multi-billionaire who funds climate denial movements. So this institutional hijack we're trying to turn into a movement around the world that's getting oil out of our culture. Artists started producing work for us that they fund. This is one by Conrad Atkinson. So we sell these prints to fund ourselves for the money we need for materials. Even in pop culture, does anybody watch Fresh Meat? It's a kind of story of young people living together. One of the characters stands on a BP kind of student career fest and makes a speech about BP, pulls the bags from underneath her skirt and has an oil spill at a BP event. So our work started to get recreated out there, and it's always a buzz to do that. Another group called BP or Not BP is focusing on the British Museum. They recently did a beautiful exhibition of the history of BP in 10 objects. This is oil from the Gulf of Mexico. So they're confronting things. There's a fossil-free funds movement now to label different art groups as fossil funds free, the positive vision. In New York, you might know about the work of the Illuminator in Occupy, projecting the 1% on different buildings. Here the Illuminator points to the fact that the new Whitney Museum has a gas line of fracked gas coming into New York. So to frack in New York is illegal, but New York uses fracked gas, and it actually comes in under the building. The building is actually part of the pipeline. So we're working with different movements. In the Louvre before COP, we went to the Louvre, place obviously after the attacks in Paris was full of cops and military and guns at the Louvre. Fortunately, the climate angels came along and we could do our action there. That's me with an umbrella of the fossil-free culture movement, and we launched it at COP, an international movement. The latest version of which is fossil-free culture in the Netherlands, and here is the girl with the Shell earring. The museum that painting is in is sponsored by Shell. We pay attention to aesthetics, and we think everybody should, not just because we're artists, because it kind of matters. Birthmark is one of the later pieces that we did, where, let's go straight to it. People have had, we went into that same gallery where climate change started changing, human activity started changing there. And this is the world's first gorilla tattoo parlour in a national public gallery. And people are having tattooed on them the birthmark. That is the parts per million in the atmosphere the year that they were born. A lot of tattoos were done in the gallery that day, but now people are beginning to have them around. It's something, I want a tattoo. What would I have a tattoo around? The parts per million is becoming a thing. If you fancy having the parts per million tattooed anywhere on your body, the next tattooing session takes place at the Live Art Development Agency on 30th of April. So if you wanted to commit to that. So different artists are now giving those tattoos. So 11th of March, The Independent breaks the story. BP ends its controversial sponsorship of Tate. We win. BP's paying £224,000 a year for bad PR. The gallery has become a place where we amplify what is really going on, and it's not worth them paying that money anymore. They're still happy to pay their CEO millions and millions in bonus. This is not about the money. I've left some reference books here because the art world's really good at doing beautiful books. And so there's loads of texts which will circulate, I think, afterwards. We haven't got the time now, that speak more to these issues. You might have been to the Disobedient Objects exhibition at the V&A. So the curator of that is a member of Liberate Tate. And there's these wonderful books that go into a little bit more that kind of survey of the relationship between art and activism. So thank you very much. That's been a little bit longer and I haven't given proper time for discussion, but is there anything that we want to unpack a little bit there in the last few moments? Any questions?
I guess I just wonder what the next steps would be, because there's one thing saying that it's been a success, but like with any movement, that was almost just your catalyst, right, to look at the fact that there's a systemic issue with the art world and its relationship with organisations like BP. So I guess would Liberate Tate consider now moving on to piss off someone else until they stop?
Yeah. So the investment that we've all made personally means that myself and all the members of the group are in quite a strange space now. We want to celebrate this victory. We want to really speak about it a lot. That's why we're doing talks like this about what we're doing and where next. We might continue. We're very interested in this idea of institutional liberation. We might drop the Tate bit and become Liberate. And a lot of different folks have given us places to consider these things. So in a few weeks' time, we're going to a place called Dial House, set up by an anarchist group called Crass in the 80s. And the members of that group have invited us to be with them once again in a beautiful space in Essex to think through these very issues. So that's what we're looking at. We want to be part of continuing the fossil-free culture movement internationally. We want to be part of institutional liberation. We want to continue to make great art. But we might decide we've done our piece, this moment has ended, and we will recombine in different places, or we might continue and reappear. Watch this space.